Have you ever had the experience of walking out of a movie you just saw with a friend and you say you loved it and your friend, not so much? There are a lot of reasons why we have these different experiences of the same thing. Taste, preferences, how we feel in the moment. Was the popcorn fresh? They all have significant impact, but our expectations tremendously influence how we feel and experience almost everything. How do we know? Well, a terrific experiment gave two groups of people the same breakfast shake and then measured their ghrelin levels before and after they consumed the shake. Ghrelins are the hunger hormone, and when their count is high in our blood, it means we're feeling hungry. And when the ghrelin count is low, it means we're feeling full. One group in the experiment was told that the shake was light and low calorie. The other group was told that it was thick and high in calories, though of course it was exactly the same shake. Now, people in the experiment who were told that it was the thick, high-calorie shake said they felt full afterwards compared to the other group. Not only did they feel full, but their ghrelin count matched their feelings. Body and mind working together to deliver on the expectations that were set by the experimenters. In short, expectations matter. In this episode, which was originally published in November 2022 and was co-hosted by one of our colleagues in behavioral science, Christian Hunt, we share our conversation with science writer David Robson. David is one of our heroes because his research is carefully done and he's an expert at science communication. We hope this episode helps you think about the expectations that you had for 2024 and the expectations you're creating for 2025. As I said, expectations matter.
Welcome to Behavioral Groups, the podcast that explores stories, science, and secrets from the world's brightest thought leaders for the curious at heart. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We like to investigate the aspects of behavioral science that will improve your well-being, your relationships, and your organization by helping you find your groove. We talk to best-selling authors and researchers to uncover insights into better understanding our behaviors. And we like to have a little fun while we're doing it, too.
This episode is fun for Tim and me for a couple of different reasons. For me, it was the opportunity to speak with a guest who has studied and written a lot on the expectation effect, a phenomena that I find super fascinating, and I'm sure that you, our listeners, will as well.
And for me, it was the opportunity to record our discussion live, face-to-face with our guest in a super cool studio in London. I think it's the place they call Abbey Road.
You can't tell that you're still buzzing about this at all.
I am.
I know. It's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing.
It really is. I am still buzzing. I mean, just walking into Abbey Road's lobby, and they're right next to the reception desk is the original manuscript for the orchestration for Paul McCartney's song Yesterday. Like, oh man, it was like a big fat club hitting me right over the head that this is the place where it was scored and recorded. Oh, it was amazing.
Oh my gosh. Of course, another reason that this was fun and is that we were joined at Abbey Road by our friend, fellow behavioral scientist, and fellow podcast host, Christian Hunt.
That was fantastic, too. Christian joined us for these Abbey Road sessions, and he's going to be publishing them on his podcast, which is the show Human Risk. So you've got to check that out because it's fantastic, and Christian does a fantastic job. But of course, after you've listened to the version on Behavior Groups.
Of course, after that, you can go there. So I had super high expectations for these sessions, Tim, and looking back, they exceeded those expectations in every way. And Christian was a huge part of that. And speaking of expectations, let's tell our listeners about our guest for this episode.
Definitely. Well, our guest is David Robson, and he's an award-winning science journalist who got deeply interested in the effects of expectations several years ago, and which started him digging into the topic with literally wild abandon.
Yeah, David was curious about how our expectations mold how we think, feel, and behave. And in his new book, The Expectation Effect, How Your Mindset Can Change Your World, he brings forth research from a variety of fields that shows how our mindsets influence how we navigate the world, probably much more than we realize. And I have to say, Tim, that so far this has been my favorite book of 2022.
Wow, that is saying a lot. I mean, we've read a lot of great books in 2022, and you've read a lot of great books in 22. So that's saying a lot, man.
It is. And not only was this book great, but this interview exceeded my already high expectations for what I had for it.
Well, I would agree with you there. We covered a lot of ground with David, from how expectations impact and change our perceptions, our behavior, and even our physiology.
Yeah,
And
wow, that was cool.
And David was great at being super open about the catalysts in his life for being so interested in the expectation effect.
It was truly a deep and insightful conversation that we know that you, our listeners, will enjoy. And when you do enjoy it, we hope that you share it with a friend or two so that they can enjoy it as well.
Absolutely. So with that, sit back with a cold glass of high expectations and expect to be blown away by our Abbey Road studio recording with David Robson. David Robson, welcome to Behavioral Grooves at Abbey Road Studios.
Yeah, I mean, it's my complete pleasure, but it's not a more iconic location than this, really.
No, I would agree. We always start with a speed round. Kurt, do you want to? Oh, I'm going to start with a speed round. So, David, I would like to know: do you prefer tea or coffee?
Tea.
Imagine that.
Here we are.
Here we are in England, and you prefer tea over coffee. All right.
That's good.
If you went on a vacation, a holiday, would you prefer to have a fixed itinerary or no itinerary at all?
Somewhere in between, actually. I like to know where I'm staying, but to have this kind of opportunity to be spontaneous as well.
See, that aligns. I like that. That's at least the first night you want to be able to know where you're sleeping. So
Definitely.
There you go.
And let's try one and say, would you prefer to record a podcast on Zoom or at Abbey Road Studios?
Abbey Road Studios, obviously.
Well, at least we got that right. I mean, if nothing else goes here, you got that going.
Yeah.
Can positive thinking eliminate our unhappiness and anxiety?
Positive thinking alone can't. If you're taking this kind of attitude of being like this kind of Pollyanna figure who just looks at the world through this kind of rose-tinted lens, but actually if you apply positive thinking a bit more rationally, a bit more kind of objectively, then yes, it can be very beneficial.
So we're getting into your book, obviously, The Expectation Effect. And for all the listeners out there, it is by far my favorite book of the year, so I definitely go out and read it. But what I loved about this book is that you're bringing in a lot of research, because that's what you do, right? You write about science and you bring in the research and kind of culminate it. If you had to describe this book for our listeners, and short kind of the elevator speech type thing, how would you describe this book?
So I'd say the basic concept is that the expectation effect describes our capacity to form self-fulfilling prophecies, and that happens through three main mechanisms, which is changes to our perception, changes to our behaviour, and changes to our physiology. And actually all of those mechanisms are really important, and they're interrelated, and we shouldn't kind of neglect one over another one. They're all critically important, but what you see is that the expectation effect can have incredible outcomes. It can even change your longevity. It can't perform miracles, but it certainly does have like a really important role in our health and well-being, and even how long we live.
How would you define expectation effect for those who are sitting here going, well, all right, I've never heard of expectation effect. What would you define that specific piece as?
So, I mean, that is kind of how it's this phenomenon where we create these self-fulfilling prophecies. But I would always give an example as well when I'm explaining it. And I do think the placebo effect is it's very well known, very familiar, and very well researched. And, we know that that's not this kind of miracle cure, but that often a patient's beliefs about the effectiveness of a treatment can change the outcomes. And we know that can change our subjective perception of what we're experiencing, but also it can have objective physiological effects too. So if you're taking a placebo painkiller, your brain actually can start to produce its own endogenous opioid painkillers. So, and you can see that activity in brain scans, and you can see how that's, actually them reducing their pain in some kind of meaningful way. It's not just them kind of imagining that they're feeling better, they actually are feeling better.
Now, the placebo effect isn't 100% universal. Not everyone responds to it, right? This is a relatively, it's a significant portion of the population that responds to placebos. Is expectation in general something that is going to have some effect, some implications for some portion of the people, but not everyone?
So I think it really depends on the kind of domain you're talking about, actually.
Okay.
So, because I do think, if you're talking about fitness compared to kind of the clinical setting, or if you're talking about diet or aging, you have to kind of look at what people's original kind of baseline beliefs are. And so, you could have someone who already has a very good appraisal of their own kind of physical fitness, and, they love doing exercise. And then I would say, well, actually, they don't need to change their expectations. And if you kind of prime them to think that they're, naturally good at exercise, that's not going to have any effect because they already believe it. Similarly, someone might have such a deeply ingrained belief that they're no good at exercise, then an experimental manipulation isn't really going to be that beneficial, because you have to kind of go deeper with them. I think you would have to kind of work harder to change their beliefs. So yeah, I think there's definitely an average effect across the population, and I think that in different domains people could benefit from the expectation effect in one way or another. But it's going to depend on the person and on the circumstances.
So just to follow that up, are there what domains have you seen the greatest impact?
So I think one that's very common would be stress and people's responses to stress. And I think this is because within our culture, we have such a pervasive kind of belief that we're fed through the media, through, books and magazines, and, even, from health organizations, we have this idea that stress is inherently dangerous and it has to be avoided and suppressed. You should suppress your anxiety or you won't perform well. And what we see actually is that by changing that mindset about stress, without getting people to kind of pretend they're not feeling the stress, and also without deceiving them, but just letting them kind of accept that the stress can be really unpleasant, but it can convey some kind of useful meaning to them, and that actually the physiological changes we feel with stress, things like the racing heart, well, that's adaptive, and that it can actually be helpful, certainly in the short term, to have that kind of oxygenated blood pumped to your brain. We do see that when you help to educate people about that stress has this kind of potential positive side. It can be energizing, it can sometimes be enhancing. That actually then you do see a really meaningful effect on, I think, quite a large number of people. That and it can do everything from, changing how well they respond in a high pressure exam or giving a public talk, but also it changes things like how quickly they recover from the stressful situation. And that's really important, because that's going to reduce the long-term effects of the stress too. If each stressful event only lasts for, an hour or so, rather than then lingering as this kind of prolonged anxiety for the day, that has a benefit for your health as a whole over months and years.
And I think you brought up in the book, and I think I've heard this as well, but cortisol levels are affected by this. I mean, a number of, as you talked about at the beginning, right? There's the perception change, the behavior change, but there's also a physiological change that can happen just because of the way that we're thinking about something, which is the piece that just blows my mind in this whole thing. It's I understand the way we think about something and the expectations we do that, but our body actually is responding differently in some of these situations. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, stress is one of my favorite examples of this. So, if you have a negative view of stress, you tend to see very big fluctuations in cortisol, extreme fluctuations. And, that is not so good for you, really. It's kind of getting you too energized in a way, because you're looking for danger. You're not really looking for opportunity. You're just looking for the danger around you. And, that's going to overwhelm your thinking if you're doing an exam, so you don't have the cognitive resources to actually think of the correct answer. If you're giving a talk and you have such high levels of cortisol, you're more likely to focus on all of the frowning faces in the crowd, rather than being able to step back and seeing that actually people are just paying attention to you. But also, you do see a more moderate change in cortisol when you have this kind of positive mindset. But also you see increases in anabolic hormones. So that's things like DHEAS or testosterone. And actually these anabolic hormones, they're really important for kind of the growth of tissue and maintenance of tissue. And so it's that ratio actually between the cortisol and then these other kind of beneficial hormones that, actually determines the long-term effects of the stress too.
I was just thinking that probably the stress is why Tim can't ask any good questions. Is that how that works?
Did you say something, Kurt? I'm sorry. I was just focusing on David.
But I mean, there's something interesting here, which is on one level, all the things you're talking about, they have a useful purpose. And it's just that we're not using them. So the way I, as you were describing it in the book and the way you talk about it, my sense is sort of that we are potentially underusing certain things or overusing them, and that gets us to bad outcomes. But fundamentally, these things all serve a purpose, and we can, if we channel that in the right way, we can get the best out of ourselves. So you're really looking, it's almost a sort of hacking process of saying, when does this work really well, and when's it beneficial, and when should we absolutely try and dampen it down and stop it?
Yeah, that's absolutely how I see it. And especially with something like stress, we know we evolved that way because actually it is really beneficial, not just in the fight or flight response when you're kind of fleeing from a predator or, fighting it, but also, we have that more moderate kind of stress response, which would be beneficial if you're, challenging a rival to be the leader of your group, or if you're kind of going on a prolonged hunt, So yeah, these all evolved for a reason. And I think what happens now is that we sometimes catastrophize our thinking, and I think that's really that's especially with stress, I think that's where the problem's coming from, is that you have this kind of baseline anxiety, getting the new job, passing the exam is really important for you, so you feel anxious because it's meaningful. That in itself isn't really damaging, that's just getting you energized. But then we have this assumption on top of that the anxiety itself is going to lead us to fail and that it's going to be bad for our health. So that creates this kind of second layer of stress. And I think it's that we want to eliminate, really. And because actually, those assumptions that the anxiety is going to damage your performance, well, that's not objectively true. It can be true if you have the negative stress mindset, but not if you have the positive stress mindset.
I love that. Yeah, I love the way that you're talking about it. Catastrophizing our thinking is really a fantastic way of thinking about this. It also kind of reminds me of how we conflate anxiety when it comes from uncertainty or risk, which are two really different things in the world today, but they feel the same. And so does the expectation effect kind of get us to changing the way we feel? Does it actually change our of course, there's physiological changes. Do we actually feel differently emotionally?
So I think we do. So I would say, when the kind of scientists roll out these interventions, they are quite careful to say to these, to their participants that, you don't have to, enjoy feeling stressed. It might...
Good. We're glad about that. Okay.
Because, it can feel unpleasant, especially if you've got, these assumptions around it. But it's just kind of recognizing kind of cognitively that, it may be there for a reason. But actually, I think once you do get through that stage, I see these as kind of incremental changes that you make. When you're changing your mindset, it's not it all happens at once. I mean,
what? I thought we were looking for a miracle. That's right, not a miracle. Okay, sorry.
Because I would say I've done that myself with my attitudes to public speaking, and it's I kind of went through that first step of changing kind of cognitively how I appraised the stress, and then I saw that had this kind of immediate kind of benefit. It didn't make me this kind of amazing charismatic speaker, but it did mean I hope that I performed better, that I kind of felt less distracted, during the talk. But it wasn't I suddenly felt just really, positive throughout the talk. I
want to do this every day, every moment of every day.
Exactly. I still had the butterflies in my stomach. But actually then over time, the more I did it, the more I got to realise that actually those feelings of anxiety were closer to excitement than kind of fear.
Yeah.
And, I mentioned in my book, Billie Jean King kind of spoke about, because she hated public speaking, but she saw that it was, her responsibility, and it came with part of the job. If she wanted to win the matches, she had to take that on as well, being a spokesperson. And so she said that pressure is privilege. And so I think that's how it also changed my attitude. It's because the stress I was feeling was because it was so important to me, because I want to communicate these ideas as well as I can. And actually recognising that is also really powerful, I think, in changing the stress response and helping you to be more positive.
What you just said there just, it made me think of, I don't know if you've ever read the book Disagreements. It's by David Robson. It's a prodded me to think about this idea that, so the tool that we can use is the reframing aspect of this. So reframing public speaking as this is part of my job and therefore it's different. And I see that just in everyday life, right? Where you're going in and you're doing something that you might not like having to work with Tim, and then I kind of have to go, but it's my job, and so it makes it that much better, and we can laugh about it.
It's not worth the pay. I'm just telling you, it's not.
Is reframing a key component then of how you can use the expectation effect to your benefit?
Yeah, it really is. And I think, we knew from, cognitive behavioral therapy that reframing can be really effective in helping people to deal with things like anxiety and depression. And then I think what the new science has really shown is that actually this process is then also bringing about these physiological changes too, and, broader behavioral changes. So, when you change your stress mindset, it's not just about the physiology, actually. What happens is that your thinking can become more creative and more proactive. So you start approaching the situations that were scaring you rather than avoiding them. So if I was really nervous about a talk in the past, I might have just tried to leave the preparation till the day before because I just didn't want to think about it. But actually with a more positive mindset, by recognizing it's kind of an essential part of my job and actually my choice to do that. Like, I don't have to do this job. Like, by recognizing that, then it, I was more likely to prepare more in advance, to rehearse on my own. And so that in itself is then going to reduce the stress you're feeling. So it's kind of has effects, immediately, and then kind of in the midterm and longer term too. It's very powerful for that reason. And reframing is just so fundamental to all of that.
I love that. Yeah.
As you sort of look at it, I'm fascinated by what drove you to look at this in the first place. Because it's something, when you talk about it, it's something we all recognise. But I think I already looked at it, sort of accepted that, well, that's just the way things are. But you've kind of gone there and said, well, I'm going to analyse. What was it that inspired you to look at that?
So, I mean, as a science writer, I'd always, kind of covered the placebo effect when new kind of results came out. But then it was a weird coincidence. It kind of collision between my personal and professional life. So I was going through this period of depression, and I just took these very standard antidepressant pills. And my doctor, just as she's obliged to do, she told me that one of the potential side effects would be that I would experience kind of bad headaches. And then I did experience them, almost straight away. Like the next day when I started taking the pills, it was really tough to kind of focus on my work. I felt like it was like a kind of, pickaxe through my brain, like the pain was so sharp. But at the same time, I was actually writing this article about the nocebo effect, which is the opposite of the placebo effect. So with the placebo effect, it's good intentions producing good outcomes. With the nocebo effect is when your expectations are negative and you think you're going to become sick, and then you do. And what the research had shown very clearly was that lots of drug side effects, especially things like headaches or nausea, fatigue, all of those, actually do arise from the expectations. So in the clinical trials where you have people taking a placebo pill or the actual drug, well, the people taking the placebo pill see some of the benefits of the drug, but they also often experience the side effects that they've been warned about. And that I looked into the data for the pills I was taking, and, that seemed to explain a lot of the side effects that people were feeling. And that recognition of that fact, it wasn't like I was kind of then started, saying a mantra to myself or anything like that. I just opened my mind to that possibility that actually the pain wasn't actually inevitable and that it could have been produced by these expectations. And that, was enough to resolve the pain. So, I kind of learned that in the morning, went out for lunch, had like a big glass of water, and by the end of the day, the pain had gone and it never came back. Wow. So that showed to me how powerful expectations could be. And that was a few years ago. I, kind of kept on collecting papers, and eventually I'd amassed, 400 peer-reviewed results that had looked at all elements of expectation in our life. So, concerning stress, fitness, diet, sleep, aging. And it was at that point really where I felt like this was a huge story. They were all interlinked, but they all needed to be treated kind of separately too. And that was why I wanted to write a book to kind of explore it in that level of detail.
Yeah, I think there's been lots of really great research out there. And I think the missing piece that I think the expectation effect, the book that you wrote kind of does, is kind of weaves those together. One of our favorite researchers on this is Aaliyah Crum out of Stanford. And so we did a deep dive into the milkshake study, which is still, to this day, blows my mind away. And anybody who wants to can listen to our back episode on that. But you quote Aaliyah in the book, and I want to just make sure I get this quote right. So let me say it, sir. Yeah, you quote her saying, our minds aren't passive observers simply perceiving reality as it is. Our minds actually change reality. In other words, the reality we will experience tomorrow is in part a product of the mindset we hold today. I just love that quote, and I would love for you to kind of talk about, so expand on that. What is this, like the mindsets today impacting us tomorrow? How is that? How would you expand upon that for our listeners to just say, what can they take from this?
I mean, so that was Ali was talking at the World Economic Forum, I think, and immediately caught my attention, like, because it's a very bold statement.
It is.
Her research, and then all of these other, it's not just one lab. It's like across the world, people are finding these the same results. So it's very robust. And yeah, I think what Ali is really getting at there is the fact that we do see these kind of short-term effects, like with the milkshake study. If someone hasn't listened to, listeners haven't heard that episode before, she showed that just the labelling of a milkshake could change people's hormonal response to the food.
The ghrelin levels in your gut are changed. It's not,
And so, that is significant in itself. But I think what she's really getting at there is that also it's like the culmination of all of these expectation effects, like all of the beliefs we're carrying around, like that is shaping our experience every day. And it's also kind of putting us on different trajectories. And that's what I really wanted to emphasize in my book. It's like, changing your expectations isn't going to be a replacement for changing your diet or doing lots of exercise, but your beliefs about those activities will shape, partly how effective they are, but also how, easy it is to kind of stick to those goals. Because if you're dieting, but because of your mindset, your ghrelin levels are, much higher than they would be if you had a different mindset about your food, if you saw it as being this indulgence. Well, that's going to make you, have loads more hunger pangs. It could potentially change your metabolism. We know it could kind of slow down your metabolism, make you feel more lethargic to conserve energy. It's just going to make the process of dieting feel so much more difficult. So you're more likely to give up.
What I love too about that kind of it got to me thinking is it's this idea that we all have these mindsets, but we don't examine them. So we don't actually think about the mindset I'm bringing into dieting. I don't think about the mindset that I have about stress. I don't think about the mindset I have about sleep. And thus, by not thinking about that mindset, not examining that in ourselves, we're stuck with whatever that preset from society, from our families, from whatever past that we've had. So that past is now impacting our future. Whereas, to your point, when you looked at that, the side effects that your doctor talked about, but then you examined it a little bit more and you can reshape that, reframe that as we talked about, then you can actually go forward and say, yeah, it's not a miracle. It's not going to just change the world, but at least you can be purposeful about it.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. And it's, it's like one element that has just been neglected, I think, a lot. It's like you might have good intentions to go to the gym. Like I know I did before I kind of examined.
I always have good intentions.
My intentions are fantastic. Oh, my God.
And actually, I kind of did have the kind of willpower to kind of go regularly, but I really hated the process. And then and also I didn't see like a huge amount of progress while I was doing it. And so I saw that actually changing my mindset about exercise actually just kind of took the brakes off of what I was doing. So it felt more pleasurable. And also, I did then start to kind of build my stamina, build my strength. It was, kind of transformational that way. And, but going back to that, about the idea about whether we examine our assumptions or not. Well, I had just, I hadn't loved gym classes in school, to be honest, because I was the youngest in my year. I was quite short for my age for most of high school, so I was always the last in the race. So I had always had this kind of assumption that I just wasn't cut out for exercise. It would always be difficult for me. But really, when you look at that, well, there's no good factual basis for that. I was never I never had the makings of being an Olympic athlete, but that also didn't mean that I couldn't enjoy exercise and benefit from exercise. So yeah, I think that's something that is, I kind of talk about our expectations as being like the air we breathe, because they, kind of permeate us, but we often just don't even recognize that we just kind of think they're, the truth without really examining like what is the evidence behind that.
I love the way you frame that too, because it's not as if, I'm tired of reading self-help books that are just like, you can be an Olympic athlete, you can do whatever you want to do, that the world is your oyster. It's like, give me a break. I'm never going to be a guy who can dunk a basketball. Just never. Aside. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Kurt's like, yeah. Okay. So, kind of just given my height, that's just never going to happen. But I could enjoy the game of basketball. I could still go and kind of consider it, something that's worthwhile. And I think that's a really cool frame in and of itself. That was just my editorial. Now my question is this: I'm curious about. It seems like marketers have been doing, and advertising, executives have been doing this for some time. Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. Aren't they kind of trying to mold our expectation to think that cigarette with all that nicotine is going to be fantastic, before I taste it, and then some people actually like it.
I mean, they totally are. And, because I've kind of, have spoken to marketers about the expectation effect, and do they poo-poo it? They're just like, no. No, so they get it, but they've also asked me kind of, but they're always careful, in their own work, not to kind of raise expectations to the point that, the product won't meet the expectations, because then that leads to disappointment is so much worse from a consumer point of view. Yeah. And so, sometimes they would actually deliberately underplay some of these elements, especially if you're talking about like a theme park or, some kind of experience. They want people to kind of come to the conclusions themselves. And I think that's a really good approach. And, I think that actually just applies to all the expectation effects. It's like if you're going to the gym and you think you're telling yourself through some kind of like, mantra, I am an Olympic athlete. And then you're still taking, 30 minutes to do like a 5K run. Well,
maybe not an Olympic time.
Right. And then you're going to, feel disappointed, and you assume the expectation effect can't work. But the expectation effect can't produce immediate gains, to that kind of level. So I think having like overly optimistic expectations is damaging. But what we need to do is just look at kind of whether we're doing that kind of, whether we're like needlessly pessimistic, whether we are catastrophizing, kind of correcting that, bringing it up to this kind of sweet midpoint, I think, where you're kind of questioning whether you're capable of more than you're achieving currently, without trying to kind of tell yourself that you're, kind of the greatest person in the world. You don't need to do that to benefit from the expectation.
And I mean, it's interesting when you talked about advertising, Tim, which is sort of positive framing. And I'm struck, David, by the negative one around, okay, watch out, you may suffer these particular, take this drug, and these are we have to disclose the side effects. And if I think about sort of products that are sold on a negative basis, so insurance, look at all these awful things that might happen to you. There's that flip side of it. And I wondered, it's in many respects, it seems to me we warn people of things for good reason, but we're driving expectations in a direction that's really not helpful. And I wondered how we balance that. Because obviously you don't want people to sort of think, well, there's no risk here whatsoever. But equally, if you're looking for danger, as you say in the book, you'll find it.
Yeah, I mean, and that is the big problem with kind of applying the placebo effect and, countering the nocebo effect in medicine. Because, doctors, I think they are ethically obliged to kind of explain the risks of a procedure or treatment to the patient. So the question is, well, how can you do that without kind of worsening their symptoms or making their experience, a lot more uncomfortable than it really should be? So there's some research on this, and it's all about kind of the way you phrase the risks, essentially. So, framing, we've known from like behavioral economics that framing can be super important. So, people respond more positively to something that's 5%. That's 95% fat-free rather than 5% fat.
Oh, yeah.
Gets me every time.
It's my favorite. Yeah.
And so actually the same goes for like nocebo effects. What you find is that this is still ongoing research, but it seems to be that if you tell someone that 1 in 10 people are going to suffer from headaches, then that kind of creates a stronger nocebo effect than if you tell them that, some people experience headaches, but 90% of people don't, because you're focusing more on the positive. You're still giving the same information, but you're just phrasing it in a way that I think stops people becoming too kind of focused on the negative.
You talk in the book about the brain being a prediction machine. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays into the expectation effect and what that implies?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really fashionable theory in neuroscience, and especially the kind of neuroscience of consciousness.
Yeah.
And this idea is that the brain, as a prediction machine, is constantly building kind of simulations of the world around it. So it's based on our previous experiences, then based on the context that you find yourself in. It's kind of trying to simulate, the whole world around you, like the sensory input that you're having, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're tasting. And often it's shaping that sensory data, because often the sensory data by itself is it's ambiguous, it's messy, so these simulations are helping to kind of refine that, so they can fill in the gaps if, you're missing some important piece of data, but it kind of from what's, from the surrounding pieces of data and then from the context, it kind of knows roughly kind of what to add to that image to make it make sense. Other times it might be toning down kind of sensory data that it doesn't think is so significant. So, you're listening to like a voice on a crackly telephone line. Well, if you're familiar with the person's accent and you kind of roughly know what they're going to say, it's kind of amplifying like the meaningful words and kind of downplaying the static. So we know that does happen. We know it has a huge effect on perception, and it can explain all kinds of visual illusions. It can explain, how people might hear like a voice in the static of a radio, believing it's kind of dead relative. It's because of the prediction machine kind of, leading you down this line. And, it works well enough for what it has to do for our survival, but that doesn't mean it's totally flawless. But I think what we then know is that these simulations are actually then feeding into the way the brain kind of prepares the body for the challenges it's going to face. So it will use those simulations to change levels of hormones, to change the activity of the nervous system, the digestive system, to raise or lower inflammation, all of these things, all of which served an important purpose in our past to kind of prepare us for injury, for example, but which now could also contribute to those placebo and nocebo effects.
I love that. I can't miss the opportunity to integrate a little bit of Abbey Road connected to the Beatles, connected to George Harrison. In an interview several years after he had been to India and learned transcendental meditation, Dick Cavett said, so now that you're 7 years into this transcendental meditation, all this peace and harmony, do you ever get stage fright? And George Harrison very quickly said, oh, of course. Of course I do. Of course I still do. And I remember when I first saw that interview, I thought, oh, no, transcendental meditation doesn't work. Oh, this is awful. But he quickly followed it up with, you can't stop those feelings, but how he channeled it, how he framed it, and maybe this was even before CBT, the way he framed it actually became something positive. But he didn't deny the fact that he still got butterflies going on stage after all those years of performances. I'm editorializing again.
You are. That's okay.
It's great, though. It's good.
Okay.
That's usually my job. You are stealing my job. What is going on?
But reframing would you say reframing is the central story to
what other
the
tools? What other
let's
tools
talk about
are
the
there?
tools.
Yeah, so I do think reframing in itself is important. I think applying critical thinking is really essential. So that is, questioning your assumptions and questioning what you're being fed. So, for example, like in the chapter on aging, so essentially like our beliefs about the aging process, whether we think it's going to be, broadly positive or broadly negative, whether we associate aging with, growth and wisdom or with kind of decline and disability and vulnerability, well, that can have this kind of knock-on long-term effect on your health through, kind of changes to your kind of chronic stress levels, essentially. If you feel vulnerable because you assume aging is going to bring you disability, that raises your stress levels, it raises inflammation, and then that has all these knock-on effects that can, have important ramifications for your risk of dementia, even your longevity. So, those are kind of the facts. We know the mechanism is quite well established, but how do we deal with that? And I think one important way that people can deal with that is to kind of think critically about the kind of ageist messages they're getting from our culture, which are just so pervasive. In adverts and films and, the books we read, even in our interactions with other people, the kind of jokes people make as you hit like a kind of milestone age. It's
Don't say a word.
Age,
Don't say a word, Kurt. Don't you dare say a word.
And lots of people, kind of endorse them themselves. And I think, this is the problem, is that you might be making those jokes when you're like 30 or 40, and then, you reach like 60, 70 or 80, and suddenly it's applying to you and you've internalized that message. Yeah. So actually critical thinking there is really important, and that you should be questioning, why do I assume that, it's going to be this way? And how could I, look for like the positive role models that actually of people who just have continued with their kind of creative output. Yep. They've tried new things, they've learnt new skills, they've kind of broadened their horizons as they get older. All of that all of those kinds of skills, I think, are so important in, they have this kind of protective effect. It's almost like immunizing yourself against the kind of prejudice around you.
Yeah. And you look at that from a societal perspective, and being in the West and, Europe and America, there's a definite different perception of aging than maybe some of the more communal kind of Asian cultures, where it is that wisdom of being older in different pieces. And so obviously just being able to understand the culture that you are raised in is bringing some of these messages that you've internalized, I think, is a really big piece of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
One piece that actually impacted me from your book was you talk a lot about sleep. And what I found really, really fascinating was just this idea that, again, it goes on to the piece about the anxiety that you talked about. You have anxiety, but then you have anxiety about the anxiety and different things. And the people who, like myself, have some types of insomnia at some points. It's all right, I'm kind of not falling asleep, but now I'm worried about not falling asleep. And that makes it even harder to fall asleep. But what was really fascinating was just people's perceptions on how well they slept and how well they performed the next day and felt the next day versus the actual, like when they did tracking and measurement of those. And the idea that people who actually, I didn't sleep very good, everything else was really bad. But when they looked at it, you actually got pretty decent sleep. You slept really well versus the person who, I slept great. But they looked at it and they're going, no, you were up and down and you didn't sleep at all. But that kind of interpretation of how well their sleep was then led to differences in the next day. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, exactly. So there are people, so my partner's one of these people who's a complaining good sleeper. So,
don't you just hate that? Oh my God.
So because he's always had good sleep, essentially. But then if he wakes up for, 5 or 10 minutes, he kind of exaggerates that, and he's like the next day,
he ruined everything.
Yeah, he's like,
I was up for hours.
Yeah, exactly. And he, then there's this assumption that actually, his concentration's going to suffer, he's going to be irritable. Well, those become self-fulfilling prophecies. And the science shows this very clearly. And the converse, and I would count myself in this camp, like naturally, even before I wrote The Expectation Effect, was that I'm a kind of non-complaining bad sleeper. Yeah. And that, I will look at the alarm clock and it could be that I wake up at 2 and then get to sleep at 6 or something. But I kind of always just framed that as being like, well, this isn't ideal. And if it had continued day after day after day, then I would obviously want to go to get medical treatment for that. But on those occasions where that had happened, I would think, well, I wasn't asleep, but I was kind of lying in bed. I was kind of resting. That counts for something. And also, if you count the hours around that, I could have still got, maybe 5 hours sleep in total. Well, that's not a catastrophe for me.
No.
And then so these non-complaining bad sleepers tend to function very well in the daytime. And actually, even some of the physiological effects seem to depend on our expectations again. And that's really evident in the complaining bad sleepers. So when you have bad sleep and you catastrophize that, that's when you do experience things like the higher blood pressure as a result of your poor sleep.
Is all this basically just a message to your partner to stop being a whiner?
Yeah, a little bit. We've discussed it, definitely. Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me that surprise is an interesting part of this because one of the reasons we like to know what's going on, so we want to be able to predict the future, and hence we have expectations. But surprise can be very negative, right? We're an unpleasant surprise, but equally, a gift we weren't expecting is a pleasant surprise. And so the sort of the way that surprise plays out, it seems to me that in many cases we sort of want to mitigate the risks of bad surprises, and so we start, well, what is it going to be like, so that I can. But surprise is a sort of interesting piece, and I wondered your thoughts on how those two things interact.
Well, so I had a conversation with Oliver Burkeman, who famously he wrote a book it's called The Antidote, and it was basically about why optimism is bad, pessimism is good, and so he,
Wow. Okay.
so he describes himself as this kind of defensive pessimist, and I do think there is value in that. But then he also sees value in like the process of reframing that I present in my book, because basically he said that defensive pessimism it's assuming that those kind of negative beliefs are not going to actually have any effect on your performance. Whereas if they do, then you have to maybe reconsider that position. And so that's again where I see it, the expectation effect, the message of the expectation effect as being like just kind of going to that midpoint where you're like open-minded and you acknowledge the uncertainty, and I think that's really important. So if there's a situation that could have like a good or a bad outcome, is to try not to get kind of too hooked into like one or the other, but to kind of just weigh them up and to constantly remind yourself whenever you're focusing one or the other that there's this whole range of possibilities.
Yeah. Again, I just have to re-emphasize, I love this idea of finding the midpoint, finding the middle ground. This is a wonderful message that is not about being the world's greatest athlete or rise. If you're not a CEO, you're nothing. I'm tired of books that present that message. I absolutely love the way you've approached this, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for doing it.
I do see with someone like Serena Williams, say, before she retired, but she would often be like a match point in a game, and she could still pull it back, even if that meant, winning that set from 5-love and then going on to win the next 2 sets. And I think she was probably applying this principle in that she was like, she wasn't kind of focusing on either viewpoint. She wasn't arrogantly assuming she was going to win, but she also wasn't kind of catastrophizing this situation that would be pretty anxiety inducing for most players. She was just focusing moment by moment on winning those points.
Which brings a whole nother element of that kind of thinking about things long term. Oh my gosh. It's part of, I think, many people who have sleep kind of issues. It's like you wake up and you go, oh, I didn't do this. And if I don't do that, then the client isn't going to be happy with me. And if the client's not happy with me, they're not going to hire me again, or I'm going to get fired. And then I'm going to get fired. I can't, and so all of a sudden it spirals out. And so being able to tamper that, to your point of bringing that together, I think is really good. I do want to ask, because it's one of the things that Tim and I talk about a lot, and I know Christian, we've had conversations about this as well, is ethics. And so you bring up the point of doctors, and it's part of their ethical piece of bringing this in. But what are there other aspects of kind of this research that have some ethical implications?
I think there are, and I think like the one that kind of really concerns me is about genetic testing.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a fascinating study from Stanford, from the Mind and Body Lab, that looked at how giving people information about the kind of genes they carry can actually shape their physical performance. So these participants were given this genetic test for the variety of the CREB1 gene that they carried. And we know this, gene does have an effect on, stamina, endurance, and endurance exercise. So if you have the good version, you tend to have better endurance, but also like some of the physiological measures seem to kind of contribute to that. So things like the gas exchange within your lungs, like the your core body temperature. depend on this gene. But what the researchers did, they gave the real genetic test, but then they gave the participants sham feedback. So someone with the good gene might have been told they had the bad gene, vice versa. And then they took another endurance test. And what the researchers found was that actually the expectations were playing a role independently of the genes they actually carried. So, and in some cases, actually, the expectations were more powerful than the gene. So in the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen within the lungs, the expectations really mattered. And I think that's like the danger if you get given, like, I don't think our understanding of genetics is necessarily great enough at the moment that, we're giving people a true picture. You can focus on one gene like that, but there could be lots of other genes that are equally important. But if you're, you take this kind of test at home, then you're given the results and you're told, oh, you are good at sport or you aren't good at sport, then that's going to be really important for your expectations of what you think you can achieve, and that will have ramifications. And so I feel like these genetic tests should almost come with a caveat of and an explanation of the expectation effect.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of the Pygmalion effect, right? This idea of the original research where they told teachers, oh, Christian scored really well on, Christian's a
total
6-7-year-old.
fabrication.
He was, he scored
that's
really
unethical to start with, right?
really well on this ability to learn. Whereas Tim, he didn't quite do so well. And in fact, that wasn't the case at all. It was, again, they did the actual test, but they just kind of shammed. It was a control test. And what they found is that after, 6 months of actually having the teacher teach these people with that was the only piece of information that they had, that when they actually took the test again, Christian's score on that test went way up on the IQ test that he took because of the expectations that others had on him. And so that's a different part of this, but is it related in your way?
Yeah, I think it is related. And, I think the same goes for like the use of kind of IQ tests in schools, which in the UK, some schools still have this 11 plus exam where, it kind of like plays a big role in determining which school you go to, whether it's a selective school for brighter kids or whether you go to like a kind of secondary modern where, anyone can go to that school. But I think, those IQ tests do have some predictive power, but I don't think they have a great enough predictive power that we should necessarily be giving children that kind of feedback at such a young age, because the feedback itself could change their perceptions of their self-efficacy, their motivation. It could create anxieties when they have later tests if they feel they can't, if they feel that they don't test well at such a young age, then that could have knock-on effects throughout their life. So, I think this is something we really do need to consider.
Yeah.
I was wondering, since we are here at Abbey Road Studios, if we could talk a little bit about your musical interests. Do you have any favorite playlists that you're listening to right now? And it doesn't have to be an Abbey Road related artist, by the way, by any means. But what are you listening to these days?
Quite a lot, actually. So someone I've just got into, maybe an eccentric choice, but Judy Collins' latest album.
I think that's a fantastic choice. I love that. How did you come to Judy Collins?
Well, it was just kind of, I've kind of loved her kind of music from the 60s and 70s, but then I was listening to her new album Spellbound, which is her first album. She's 83 now, and it's her first album of songs that she's written purely by herself. And, I love the songs and I think they have so much wisdom within them. But I also think it made me start thinking about this kind of age mindset again, because I think, in her 80s, she's still kind of testing her creative boundaries. And I honestly think these songs are so strong that, the album got quite good reviews and obviously she's established. But I honestly think if that was like a kind of much younger, singer in her 20s, it would have got a lot more attention still. But because of our ageism, I think we kind of write it off as an eccentricity. Whereas actually, these are really strong songs and we should be celebrating in our culture, people who are still, doing these amazing things like into older age.
I love that. When I was at the Conservatory of Music, I was told by one of the professors that, by comparison, Mozart created his greatest material by the time he was 20, Bach by the time he was, 28, Beethoven by the time he was in his early 30s. So if you're not composing fantastic music now, well, maybe you just missed the boat. And I think that this is a fantastic thing to say, that we don't have to live by that narrative. We don't have to be under the pressure of that expectation that, well, if you can't write any more songs. And here Judy has certainly proven that in a wonderful way.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's examples from lots of other areas of the arts. So like, Penelope Fitzgerald, like an incredible novelist. Well, she didn't really start publishing until she was in her 60s. And then she won like the National Book Award, quite late on in that career even. So she, and she kept on like pushing the boundaries of what she was doing. There were historical novels. There were, she wrote one kind of set in, Russia during the revolution. She was really like, I think like her creative output probably was the kind of strongest that she'd ever had in her life, even when she'd been writing for pleasure. And that's contrasted to someone like Martin Amis, who basically has always had this kind of view that old age is something that's a bit disgusting.
Yeah, right.
And then, he joked about having euthanasia booths on every street. So, yeah.
Oh my God.
So, and then he recently was saying in an interview how he could feel that what had been once a creative waterfall was kind of turning into a trickle of, and I feel like that, it's that stereotype embodiment. It's like, putting those limits on yourself.
But it's really interesting when you think about creative process, because we know intuitively there's no logic to it. You can have a creative inspiration that suddenly appears. You can have something that's built over a lifetime. And yet we like to have these logical formulations. And it seems to me a lot of what you're talking about, sort of expectations come from, well, this is the way it ought to be. Here's the model that we apply to this, and therefore we know what that model is, and then we apply that, and then when the model doesn't kind of come out to be true, we're a bit confused by the piece. And so I think, as you were talking to him, there are I think musicians that do, their first album is their best, and then everything else is down.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there's other people that say,
lots of albums
finally they've got it together. And neither strategy is correct. And I guess depending on what your expectations were going into that, you would either go, oh my, like if I've done one album and succeeded, I must be in that model of this is the first time. The second album is going to be difficult. Or if I haven't, then maybe I have to switch that other piece. But it's all sort of, it's predetermined depending. And you could make arguments for either route.
The sophomore slump, right?
Right.
Isn't that? I mean, that's
it's a big thing.
Ideal. The expectation of you had a great first album, that second one's going to suck, and maybe the third one might get back up to something.
If you get to the third album, if the label continues to support you that long,
Yeah, I mean, that's also what I think we often, with these expectation effects, we don't recognise the role of our culture and how we actually, it might be that, our broader culture is kind of determining this and making it happen. So with like artists who are getting older, well, they're not getting the promotions. So, so it becomes inevitable that there's going to be fewer older artists who are becoming famous and who are, visible to people to kind of break that stereotype. So it becomes self-perpetuating on the individual level, but also culturally.
Yeah.
But on you can apply this into work. You can apply this into, family life. You can apply all of these factors that come into play. It's not just us. It's how everybody around us is thinking that plays into our own thinking. And we could go on and on.
David Robson, thank you so much for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you for joining the Human Risk podcast as well.
It's been completely my pleasure. Thanks for so many great questions.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with David, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our high expectation brains.
Isn't that the truth, man?
Well, we have high expectations for how good these grooving sessions are going to be.
I do.
You do?
I do.
I always have pretty low expectations about how these are going to go. I think that's maybe just a self-reflection on like, oh my God, what can I say that is like better than what David's already said? I mean, my God, I don't know if we can.
Well, we can't. And maybe it's, so maybe I do have a low expectation. But what I love about our grooving sessions is that we're talking about the wonderful insights that we got from our guests, from our perspective, through the lenses of the practitioners that we have been. We're what does Neela Saldana call it? Pracademics.
Pracademics. Yes.
Yeah. Is that such a great term? And so I think that it's wonderful that we just do it from our place, and we bring our best selves to it. We both have mindsets that are very much about making grooving sessions interesting and valuable and informative, and processed through our
lens. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So where should we start? Where should we start this grooving session on David Robson?
So let's start with just the expectation effect, because I personally have been fascinated with this
since when? Yeah, when did you get cued into it?
Years, really. I mean, it started priming. I've been super fascinated with priming for a long time. Right. And then we had a conversation with John Barge a few years ago, and it was the sock piece where he was talking about, when I was talking about I use socks to prime myself, and he's like, "Oh, that's not priming. That's prompting." And that got me to thinking, and it was like, "Oh, well, but it still is changing how I'm responding." And that led me to kind of thinking, all right, what's the difference? Which got me into the expectation effect in various different pieces, how I expect things to happen. And we've talked about the wine studies and various different things for years, and those have always been great. But it actually probably goes way, 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 way back to probably one of the very first things that I can remember from going and getting my MBA is learning about the Pygmalion effect, which was probably one of my first research crushes way back in the 1990s.
I thought you were going to go back to when you were a wee little child. Growing up in Iowa. What a simple life you had.
I would say that if I was in Scotland, right? It's a wee little. I can't do a Scottish accent. I won't even try.
It goes back to the Pygmalion effect.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic, which is a great example of that. But our conversation with David focused on some slightly different versions of that, or some, let's say, different focuses, and maybe we should talk about some of the focuses that David brought up to us.
Well, so I loved. We spent a lot of time talking about stress and just the way, and to think how stress is such a constant part of many people's lives, all of our lives, in fact. But the effect that stress has on us is very different, partially based upon how we expect stress to impact us. And this idea that we can change how the cortisol levels in our bodies, how we respond to facing a speech that we have to give in front of the executives, all of these things that just because of our mindsets on this is amazing to me. It just, again, blows me away.
But you've never had to worry about stress in your own life.
We worry. I mean, no, I will have to. I'm probably not. I don't stress out about things as much as many people that I know. Maybe somebody on this call right now.
Maybe, yeah.
But stress is still one of those pieces that I think it impacts everybody. And again, the idea that we can reframe how we think about that. And therefore, by reframing it, creating a new mindset for ourselves, we can have a positive outcome from that. The idea that the sweaty palms that I have in front before going up on stage to make a presentation aren't necessarily reflecting how nervous and scared I am, but about how excited I am.
Yeah.
Just that reconstruction of those physiological components of that faster heart rate, the sweaty palms, the shallow breathing, all of those pieces can come back into play.
There have been times when I've had a particularly big gig, a new venue, a particularly large venue, a big crowd, something that sort of made this a particular performance especially important. I know that the band, it was easy for the players in my band to sort of look to me to be sort of you're leading it, so you have to get it right.
Yeah.
And when I took that on, when I adopted that mindset, I was super stressed. But in times when I when I pushed that mindset off and said, no, we're still a band. Everybody's got their own thing. We all have to do our own parts in order to make the whole sound work. That actually lowered my stress levels quite a bit, just by saying, no, there's 5 of us on stage, so let's all pull our own weight, and I'm in there doing mine, but I'm 1/5 of the whole story.
Yeah, those big concerts you did with, what was it, 10, 20,000 people kind of getting up there. I can see that stress piece that comes out from there. So a big crowd for me is 500. So still 500 people. I mean, that's pretty stressful. I could see where that happens. And again, David talked about stress. He talked about sleep. He talked about exercise. Sleep is a huge one. Sleep is, so many people have sleep issues. And so just this idea, and again, as he said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. Just because you change your expectations about something isn't going to magically make that thing change. But it does have an impact. And if you can, again, examine how you perceive things, this is one tool in a larger tool chest that you can use. So,
well, what if we turn the focus to marketing? Because there is a really important role that expectations play in what marketing does when they're marketing products or services, is to help set that expectation, oftentimes up front, though not necessarily, right? Sometimes it's upfront to help the customers understand this is what you can expect from the service provider, from the manufacturer, from the product that you're going to be experiencing. And those expectations, I think they make a big difference on how we actually literally experience the product, or literally experience the
exactly.
service.
And I think what's interesting about that is that I think for marketing or advertising, that the role that people think they're doing when they're in a marketing position, when they're in an advertising position, isn't necessarily one about changing the actual experience that people are having with their product or service. That it's about informing them and getting them motivated to go out and purchase, as opposed to actually thinking about, what I'm doing here has a impact on how our product or service actually is consumed. That the experience that people get from it can be influenced by how I talk about it.
This goes back to our conversations with Jonathan Mann on the idea of the experience itself is really just one part of the total way our brains process an experience. The first part, and maybe the most important part, is the expectation of the experience.
Yeah.
Like what we anticipate going into that experience makes a big difference. And marketers in general are underutilizing that part of building up to an experience, I think.
Yeah. And I think Jonathan Mann was talking actually about that, what we're expecting, and that is part of that journey. Again, we've talked about this. We have the expecting part, we have the actual realizing part, and then we have the memory part of this. And there's 3 parts to any experience. What is interesting is you can build that, what I'm expecting to happen, and that what I'm expecting actually changes then the real experience of it.
Exactly.
And that is this piece that I think is really powerful, that we just haven't, that marketers, that advertising agencies haven't embraced. They haven't thought about this from that perspective, at least from my experience with this. And so to that point, I think it's really important for us to reconceptualize what marketing and advertising is. And you can change that as not only are you just getting people to try the services, but you're influencing how those services are actually then going to be felt or perceived by people. This goes back, Matthew Wilcox, right? When we talked to him, where he was talking about marketing's job is to reinforce a purchase that's already been made. You can even do it post hoc, right? This idea, again, we talked about, I've experienced stress before going up on stage to give a presentation, but I can reframe how I look at those salient pieces, that sweaty palm, the heartbeat, everything, so that I'm excited. I view that as being excited as opposed to being nervous. Well,
Right.
I think marketing can do the same thing about, or you can reframe an experience with a product as that, I have a, electric car. I don't hear the room, room, room when I take off. Well, all right. So that feels like it's not as kind of a fun car. Well, you can reframe how that message gets said as like, listen to the silence of the power or something.
Right.
I'm just making that up off the top of my head. Obviously not a good marketer or advertiser here, but the idea of being able to then come in and look at what are those salient moments of an experience that you can tweak to give them a different experience within it.
I think that's really well said, Kurt. I would call the electric car experience, now that I'm an EV owner as well, is the power of silence. That there is that. And I love the fact that, we get in the car and Katie and I can talk to each other, without the engine blaring over us. And it's pretty fantastic. Let's get back to mindsets, because this, I think, is really one of the biggest parts, that you can adjust your mindset with some intentionality, right? We have talked about intentionality a lot in the 300 plus episodes that we've done, because with some intention, we can go back in and rewrite the script for what we expect, how we expect it. And it's not just about having low expectations every time. And we were joking about that earlier, but I think a lot of it is the fact that our mindsets govern so much of what we're experiencing. And I go back to an old apocryphal story about a man who has decided that he is actually, he hasn't decided. His children have decided. His adult children have decided that he can't live on his own. He's going to have to go into a home.
Yeah,
and he realizes that this is the fait accompli. He can't resist it. So he's just going to go with it. So he starts to adjust his mindset into, okay, I know that this is inevitable. I really can't take care of myself perfectly. And so kids pick him up one morning, the adult children, and say, okay, Dad, we've got 3 places to go to look. And we think that, one of them is going to work for you. And he goes into the first place and he just says, we don't need to look any farther. I respect the fact that you vetted them, that you carefully thought about it, that you love me. I'm done. This is the place number 1. Thanks, kids. I love you. Let's just call it a day. And because he changed his mindset to accept the fact that he was changing, that he was not in that place. And I love that story. I love that it wasn't a low expectation. He was really just adjusting to the reality of the world around him.
yeah.
And I think that we would be better off adjusting to the world around us sometimes, rather than just trying to have the world adapt to us.
Yeah. Well, mindsets. So we all have mindsets, right? I mean,
Yeah.
about pretty much every experience that we're going into, we have some expectation about what that experience, what that kind of process is going to be. And those expectations about that mindset that we go into this moment influence how that moment then occurs. And so if we go through life without examining what those mindsets that we hold are, then there is no power that we have to say, I can influence that moment because of the expectation I have going into that moment, because I don't take any time to reflect and to say, what are the mindsets? What is my belief? What has my upbringing, my culture, my community, my past experiences taught me about this in this type of situation, in this context, so that when I go in, I'm just a passive bystander to all of that, as opposed to being an active participant in shaping, going, no, this is what my community says. This is what culture says, but I don't need to buy into that. There are obviously other ways of looking at this, and I need to choose which way my mindset. Now it's real easy to say that, real easy to say we should all go in and examine our mindsets and to change those. But again, we have years and years, decades sometimes of this influence. And oftentimes it is an invisible influence. We don't really understand all of the components that go into shaping this. But at least let's make that effort. I think that is the big piece.
So how did this grooving session play up against your expectations, Kurt?
Didn't meet them at all. I think it just was like, my God, I thought we were going to be so like radically, insightful that it would, just change the world for people, for all of our listeners, the leaders out there who can now lead differently because they're setting expectations up for their team about the culture and the organization and the vision that they set, and making that happen for policymakers and looking at the policies we make and how do we change the expectations around this policy in order to make it so much better, about the product designers, the UX people, making sure that, wow, this isn't just about how good our product is. We have to make sure that the expectations people have on it are going to be such that it's going to maximize their enjoyment and the utility that people get out of this. And I don't think we made it. I don't know. Maybe we did.
Cue the anthemic patriotic music there.
Dun, 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 dun.
Right. Holy cow. Well, it met mine. So because I have low expectations, so I guess.
All right. Well, listeners, if your expectations were met or exceeded like Tim's during this episode, please drop us a note. Let us know what you thought. Your comments might help us create expectations for us as we work toward a future of making behavioral grooves even that much better.
And most importantly, we hope that learning a little bit about the expectation effect can help you this week as you go out and find your groove.